I have a theory about the Lumix S1H Mark II, and I think it's the one thing that could doom this camera.
But before we get started, like this video, hit the subscribe button, and consider joining the channel. Channel members get exclusive access to Filmmaker Alchemy, behind-the-scenes lessons and insights on the business of video production. Learn how to turn your content into gold.
Yes, today we're talking about the Lumix S1H Mark II, a camera that doesn't exist. No one has any information about it. I certainly don't, but I do think this camera is coming. If anything about the S1R Mark II is indication of an S1H Mark II, it's that they called it the S1R Mark II, leaving room for an H as well as an S1 Mark II. I think they'll probably stick with the same track record that they had with the S1 lineup, the S1, the S1R, the S1H, and I think the S1H Mark II will probably come out later this year. I think there's quite a few months between the S1R Mark II and the S1H Mark II. Give it a lot of breathing room, but I think the S1H Mark II is going to come eventually because Lumix would be fools to not release this camera. You know it, I know it, everyone wants to see what an S1H Mark II could be and should be and would be. We all have our high hopes and dreams and expectations of an S1H Mark II. People talk about, does it need to be 8K, but it ought to be, 6K to avoid rolling shutter issues. Of course, no overheating. If it could do 6K 60 uncropped, that would be incredible. That would scratch everyone's itch. No one would have any problems with that. Of course, taking good photos. Is it going to be a stack sensor? Is it going to do ProRes and RAW and all those good things? Is it maybe going to have an internal ND system of sorts? I don't know. No one knows. But the one thing I do know is that if the S1H Mark II does come, and I think it's going to come, the one problem is going to be if it's priced too high. This is an obvious one, right? But for all of our hopes and dreams and expectations of what we want out of an S1H Mark II, no one really wants to think about how much it's going to cost. And unfortunately for Lumix, they're in a position of not being the market leader. They're not dominant. They can't, just roll out a new camera and expect everyone's going to buy it, even though it could be the latest and greatest and have all the bells and whistles and have all the amazing features. If it's priced too high, people just aren't going to buy it. They're going to opt for something they're more comfortable with. They're going to opt for something, more suited for their needs, whatever it might be. So even though you can cram every amazing feature into one camera, which I hope they do, if that ends up costing too much, it might price out most of the people who would be interested in that Swiss Army knife type camera. Because let's face it, there's a lot of people out there who can spend a lot of money on really high-end cinema cameras or high-end photography cameras, but those aren't the tools or devices that get the mass appeal. They're not for every single person out there shooting a YouTube video, making Instagram reels, making TikToks, doing the independent content creator thing or the one-man band thing. Maybe you have a video production company. They exist all over the place. And there are plenty of people who have small teams and they have limited budget and resources. And we've all been working with the tools that we have available. And the S1H Mark II could be that perfect, most amazing camera that could do all of the things we need it to do. And yet, if it's simply too much money, to the point where you can't buy a few of them because it's a limitation of the budget, it's not going to sell enough. And that could doom this perfect camera because I think we all want it to be the perfect camera, good and low light, fast readout speeds. If they manage to put internal NDs in there, oh my goodness, I know it would sell as long as it's priced accordingly. Now we're looking at something like the S1R Mark II, which is around $3,300 brand new. That price will probably come down over time, but that's the MSRP, that's the retail, that's competitive with things like the Nikon Z8. You've got things like the Canon R5 Mark II, that's $1,000 more than that. And Sony has their lineup of tons of cameras at all sorts of different price points. So if I'm looking at the S1R Mark II saying, okay, $3,300, I really don't think the S1H Mark II can go above 4,000. And that might be a tough pill to swallow for a lot of people out there going, ooh, even that seems kind of steep. But realistically, if the S1R Mark II is priced where it's at, and if the S1H Mark II comes at a little bit more because, you know, they always like to charge us for the privilege of shooting video. Even though a lot of photographers make more than videographers, it still seems that video cameras are just inherently more expensive. The moment they put a red record button or you can shoot ProRes, all of a sudden now it's way more expensive than the photography camera. And granted, ProRes does come with a licensing cost, so maybe there's some justification to that. But in general, the video one tends to be the more expensive one. You can look at Canon and the R5 and the R5C for this similar equation. You can look at Sony and the A7S III versus the FX3, similar equation. The video version always just costs a little bit more, and Lumix will probably do the same thing with their S1 version, the S1R Mark II 3300. Maybe the S1HII Mark II comes at 3,800. I don't know. I will see. I have no crystal ball. I can't predict, but we can use history and the patterns of what's come before as predictive power for what could happen in the future. Look at Micro Four Thirds and what Lumix did with the G9 Mark II, the photo version of that camera. Even though it's got a bunch of great video features, still isn't fully baked when it comes to video. In fact, it bakes itself. It gets too hot when you're shooting video with the G9 Mark II. So that one, you know, when that came out, I think it was priced at like 2,000, but quickly kind of fell down. Maybe it's 1,800, something around there. My memory's not perfect. Dropped a little bit further down to maybe $1,500 price point. And then Lumix rolls out the GH7 for $2,200 retail, maybe, if memory serves right. It could even been more. Of course, you can pay more if you want things like the XLR2 adapter, if you want to pay for ARRI Log C. These are all things that make the GH7 even more expensive, upwards of, I think, $3,000 if you go all in on the full package at retail. Of course, those prices have come down since. So I would expect the same thing for the S1H Mark II to be closer to 4,000 than 3,000. However, let's say they try and sell it for 5,000 or 6,000. Try and do that Canon pricing strategy where things are just expensive because why not? Let's just make it expensive. People will buy it. Lumix isn't going to get away with it. And I think a lot of people would be turned off by an S1H Mark II that costs $6,000. However, there's plenty of people talking about all the bells and whistles and all the features and what that would actually cost. If they do put internal NDs in there, well, that's going to cost you. That's going to be more. If they do manage to do some crazy, you know, putting extra USB-C ports, maybe they're doing internal 32-bit float, all the rumored and speculated features that could be in an S1H Mark II, those will all come with a price point because in the landscape of cameras, those things all come with a cost. You've got things like the Nikon Z8 already shooting 8K 60, and it's priced like an S1R Mark II. So Nikon's flagship photo video hybrid, their most amazing one, shooting RAW internal, is priced at that same price now, discounted years later since its initial launch, but it's coming in discounted right around that $3,300, $3,400 price point. So if the S1H Mark II is significantly higher than that and doesn't do 8K 60 or anything close to that, which rightfully so, I think a lot of people don't want 8K. There is the diminishing returns in terms of megapixels and resolution. You see that in photography. Yes, they make cameras that can shoot 50 megapixels or 100 megapixels, and a lot of photographers choose to not shoot that way just because the files are so insanely bloated. They're harder to edit. They take up more disk space. And at a certain point, you just don't want the extra resolution. You favor other things like dynamic range or a particular set of lenses, whatever the job calls for. You don't always need more resolution. And we're getting to that point as well with video where there is a time and a place for things like 8K or even 16K if you're doing augmented reality, virtual reality, you know, side-by-side spatial video, heads-up display type stuff. But at the same time, for regular content creators, 8K is probably overkill for most things. You don't need it. We'd favor things like open gate or shutter angle or dynamic range or frame rates for that matter, uncropped. So the S1H Mark II doesn't have to be the best of everything. It doesn't have to check every box and be more than anyone else. But it should and it ought to have things that people want and they care about, which is basically everything from the original S1H, aside from the 4K 60 being cropped. We don't want that anymore. No more cropping. We don't want cropping for 4K 60 or 4K 120. No crop, please. And we want the phase detect autofocus, which the S1H, the original S1H, lacked. Obviously, the S1R, the original, lacked it as well, but now the S1R2 has it. So, of course, the S1H Mark II is more than likely going to have phase detect autofocus. But what else is going to be added to this type of camera to make it different than an S1R Mark II? What other bells and whistles could they put in there that would differentiate it in the lineup? What's the difference between the R and the H? Is it really just that megapixel count? Will the H stay lower resolution as at the sensor level? It probably should, but maybe we will see for the first time some kind of internal electronic ND in a hybrid camera. It can be done. It'll fit in these mounts. You look at something like the FX6 from Sony that has an internal electronic ND on a mirrorless mount. So it can fit, it can be done, but it hasn't been done on a true hybrid style body. It's been more reserved for the camcorder, broadcast, cinema line of cameras. But I know there's plenty of people out there, you're probably one of them, who would love to have internal NDs on something like a hybrid. And I hope these companies are paying attention to all the people clamoring for these things, because we've been asking for a long time. I think it's upwards of 10 years that I've been asking for this on a hybrid camera. Will we finally see it? I don't know. Are they going to charge us a premium for the privilege of having internal NDs? I certainly hope not, because at the end of the day, we've been making it work. And that's the unfortunate truth about the landscape of cameras, the ecosystem in general, is that almost everybody who's shooting with these hybrid cameras, depending on when you started, but a lot of us have had to adapt and deal with DIY workaround rigged up solutions. When I think back of, the GH4 back in the day, it would record 4K, but it would only record 4 gigabyte clips at a time. So you could record continuous, but your footage would be clipped up into like 20 clips for one continuous take. And we'd have jumped through all these hoops and editing to make that work, nesting and layering, trying to like make 20 clips whole. And there's other software applications that'll do the same thing. But that's the type of stuff that we've done, right? We've worked with external ND filters, whether they're variable or fixed NDs. We've all been shooting with external NDs because we've just had to. If a company comes along and says, hey, now you have internal NDs, but oh, by the way, that's going to cost you $3,000 more, there's probably a lot of people who say, nah, I'm good. I've already got my external kit. Like, I'll just make it work. It's fine. It's no big deal. Same thing is true with the overheating. Back in the DSLR revolution, we had the Canon 5D Mark II, the Canon 7D. These things were notorious for overheating. You'd pop your lens off, take the battery out, constantly having to work with overheating thermal issues. And of course, there's plenty of cameras that have caught up and done a lot better with thermal management. But still to this day, there's people shooting Sony on something like the A7 IV and dealing with overheating, even indoors, even when you're not recording. The camera just gets really hot because it doesn't have proper thermal management for the type of heavy video output that people are expecting it will do. And there's a lot of people who say the Sony A7S IV is the best camera for video because the quality is just amazing. And so you deal with the workarounds, you deal with the limitations, and you make do. Sure enough, a company could come along and say, hey, now we've got you covered. We got the same great thing, but now it's better and we've fixed those things, but oh, it's going to cost you an extra $1,000, $2,000, $3,000. Plenty of people might say, I've been making it work. No big deal. Same thing is true of 8-bit versus 10-bit. Same thing is true of all the different frame rates. Of course, you have AI now adding frames in. You've got AI adding resolution in. So even if you're not shooting 8K, you could shoot 6K and scale it up to make it look close enough to 8K. You've got denoising AI now, so even low light isn't as big of a deal as it once was. There's always a bunch of different things competing for your attention and for you to use it. Hey, this is a great new feature. Well, I solved that problem 10 years ago using a different solution that cost me $50, maybe. Who knows, whatever it might be. You get the point. The point is, the S1H Mark II, I assume, will be the perfect camera, for me anyway. It should check all the boxes, considering the S1H was really close to checking all those boxes for me. Just a little shy there on terms of autofocus. And well, to be fair, price point at the time, if I was going to spend that much money back then, it really needed to do autofocus and do it well. And it just didn't. Considering you're investing in a brand new lens lineup. This is back with the S1 initial launch. Hey, come to the L mount. Hey, buy all this new glass. Hey, buy these expensive cameras. Oh, but by the way, they don't compete with the competition when it comes to autofocus and some of the cropping stuff. But that's less of a criticism that I have personally. I can kind of make it work, but certainly not now. The S5 Mark II, that can crop because it's cheaper. It's more affordable. You start charging more, the expectation changes of you better not be cropping anything because we want that resolution. We want those frame rates at that price point. Same thing is true for the internal NDs. Same thing is true for internal, 32-bit float. If they go that route, which I think they should, that'd be great because we don't always want to have to put on a bulky XLR adapter just to get 32-bit audio. That's the interesting thing about the XLR and the XLR2 adapter is that in both situations, I didn't get either one of those because I wanted XLR. The XLR initial one for the GH5, GH6, I got it for the GH6, but I think it worked on the GH5. That XLR adapter, the DMW whatever, I just got so I could actually use 4 channels of audio. I didn't care that it was XLR. I just cared that I got 4 channels of audio. And same thing is true for the XLR2 adapter for these Lumix cameras. I don't even care that it has XLR. I don't use it for that. I use it for the 32-bit float. And so to just remove the XLR adapter entirely actually solves my problem, which is now I'm spending more for a device that takes up more physical room on my camera, changes how I have to mount the LCD screen and kind of adds this clunky box right on the hot shoe. I don't want any of that. I just want 32-bit float. Please just put it right in the camera. I'm hoping Canon, Sony, Nikon, all of them. Come on, let's just get 32-bit float built right in. And then we can move on because you got audio recorders that can do it. You got microphones. I got the DJI Mic 2. The little pack itself can record 32-bit float. Let's just get it in the cameras, please. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent, but those features, those things, those specs are going to drive up that price point. And most of these companies tend to be a little bit greedy. Hey, we're giving you so much. Hey, look at all these amazing features. Now pay us more. When in fact, I think a lot of times they got to keep the price low to remain competitive and to actually get that edge in the marketplace that they're looking for. The GH5, way back when, was very popular and sold incredibly well because it was more affordable. It was cheaper. So people were willing to look around the autofocus in video and look around the crop factor of micro four thirds compared to full frame because it was so much power in such an affordable price point. Times have changed. A lot of these cameras, the offerings from Nikon and Canon to varying degrees, and Sony for that matter, we've got full frame cameras that are very cheap, very affordable with all the most amazing bells and whistles. So the S1H Mark II might come in with even better features, but if they charge too much, they try and get more dollars than it's worth. That's where it comes into that value question. It's not a matter of, is it expensive or is it cheap? Really what we're talking about is the value that it provides and the cost to get that value. There is a breaking point where it's just too expensive, even though it might be the best or it might have all the things. If it is just too expensive, then it isn't actually providing the value when it comes to that balance of things. The cost versus the features. What's the actual value of the device? Because we all know the really unfortunate truth is that things will always get better. We'll always get new versions of these things. If history is any pattern, right? Technology moves forward, progress moves on, and there may be older versions of products that you like or prefer for a particular reason. Maybe a feature got lost along the way, but in general, things tend to get better and they tend to get cheaper. So anything you're buying now will eventually become outdated. So it always needs to meet that perfect balance of the cost to the features and the value that it's giving you, because that is only relevant now. 5 years, 10 years from now, that value won't be the same. And so I guess to wrap things up, it's just saying the S1H2, I think, is probably the most hyped, the most anticipated camera that I can really even ever imagine, because the S1H is just that loved, albeit just for a few unfortunate compromises, some trade-offs that people weren't willing to make. But everyone wants to see what an S1H2 looks like. And so if they do it right and they get those features right, which at this point they should know what everyone wants, if they get that right and they release it at the right price point where that value shines through, I can't imagine a more popular, more celebrated, more enthusiastic recommendation from everyone just saying how great this camera is. But if they charge too much, that's where they know the features. They know what they got to do. If they charge too much though, that's where they're going to mess it up.